Welcome to the Freedom Club podcast, where we discover the fight for freedom, fulfillment, passion, and purpose. Your host is Curt Mercadante, Gallup certified strengths coach, an agency founder who is dedicated to coaching individuals seeking to level up their life and their businesses. The Freedom Club is about unlocking your talents, turning them into strengths, and crushing your objectives. You can learn more at curtmercadante.com. Welcome to the Freedom Club.
And welcome to the Freedom Club podcast. I am your cruise director. I am your grateful host, Curt Mercadante, and I am grateful that you are here today. I'm grateful for each and every one of you because you help me fulfill my mission of helping individuals around the globe fight for lives of freedom and fulfillment. So thank you for being here, whether this is your first time listening or your 101st time listening. And yes, please don't be shy about stopping by iTunes and leaving us a positive rating and review, because I've said it before and I will continue to say it. Those positive reviews and ratings are like currency to us, and they help us expand our reach around this big green earth. I'm also happy you're here today because I have a wonderful guest. His name's Matt Cicconi. He and I have been friends for several years. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that I used to have a very successful public relations and ad agency. And I also worked in the political world, and that's where Matt and I met. Right now, Matt is the digital director for Churchill Strategies in Pennsylvania. And he's one of the most sought-after digital gurus in the country, thanks to the work he did on the presidential campaign of Dr. Ben Carson. Now, you may love Dr. Carson, you may dislike Dr. Carson. You may be on the left, you may be on the right, you may love politics, you may hate politics. For the purposes of today's podcast, I really don't give a damn, because today's podcast is about something much deeper. Listen, if you're in the political world, one of the end goals is working on a presidential campaign. That is the apex. And Matt not only got to do it, he was a big reason that Dr. Carson, for many months, was the front runner in the Republican presidential primary. That is saying something, my friends. But we're not going to talk about politics today. We're going to talk about Matt's journey, because while he was experiencing that success, while his career trajectory was on the way up, some very important things in his world started to crumble around him, and he had to learn a different definition of success. And that actually is the title of a documentary that was filmed about Matt's story. We're going to talk about that more on the podcast today. But my friends, many of you listening today know you are in need of some change when it comes to your definition of success. You've heard me talk about many men have to redefine their definition of the word responsibility, because it means more than just being a paycheck generator. It means being a good husband, a good father, a good human being. It means investing in yourself. And so while Matt's story today is going to talk about the toll that the work on a national presidential campaign took on him, you can apply that to your corporate job, to the business you've built. Hell, I built a very successful public relations and ad agency. It was successful money-wise, but I had built my own prison. I had put the golden handcuffs on myself. And so Matt's story is very pertinent. It's very powerful. And so I am so happy you're here to listen to it. So without further delay, here is my very powerful, very special interview with Matt Cicconi. Well, Matt Cicconi, thanks for joining us today. Two paisans here. We're talking about Italians and the Americanization of Italian names before we jumped on. So Matt, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Molto bene, grazie. Ciao.
See, I know what those mean. You're stretching, but any more than that, you're stretching my, or I know, che pranzo squisito, which is, I think, delicious lunch or something like that.
Perfetto.
So Matt and I met a few years ago. We, as many people who listen to this podcast know, I used to be in the world of public affairs, politics for many years. And I got out for a variety of reasons. Matt is still in, but he's got an interesting story, a very interesting story as it relates to the theme of this podcast, which is the Freedom Club. And we're all about escaping to a life of freedom and fulfillment when sometimes you feel trapped. And sometimes you don't know you're trapped. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because I think that applies. But the first question, the only kind of set question I ever have on this podcast is, what does the word freedom mean to you? So I'm going to ask you that now, Matt.
Great question. To me, freedom is the ability to succeed or fail on one's own merit. And I don't like manipulation of circumstances. I like the ability for myself to succeed or fail, which I think is an important aspect of freedom. It's usually skewed towards the ability to win, right? But I think you also need to be able to fail as well, because failure is where you learn the most. So that to me is truly freedom.
Do you think that in our society that we are trying to, over the last, I don't know, few decades, mitigate the risk of failure too much? Whether it's helicopter parents or maybe some of it's driven by the trial bar, right? You're not allowed to, our kids they weren't allowed to climb trees in the city park because someone might get hurt. Do you feel like that trying to mitigate the risk of failure, whether it's, we're talking about, even economically, right? In the housing crisis, student loan crisis, whatever, that we're the safety net has become a kind of a, I don't know, the good metaphor acronym, for it, but
I think the metaphor, the safety net, has become, rather than catching, it is with straining, and it is engulfing.
Yeah.
There's one thing to be said about having a community of people, whether you're more on one side of the spectrum, thinking that government should be the net community, or you're more on the other side of the spectrum, thinking more like church or local community or family should be that net. Either way, I do think that there is something to be said about having a community, a support system there to help. Because I think that's the underlying presupposition, is that we have to understand, is that we are going to fall and we are going to fail. But I think that's where the philosophy difference and bifurcation happens, is who and how should we have that net. But yeah, I do see, I grew up in the 80s, I was born in 83, giving away my age. But
you're a youngster.
Yeah. I've still got some Sprite left in me. I grew up in the country, and I wasn't ever worried, or my parents really weren't ever worried about, I think, so much of the stuff that communities now are very paralyzed by fear about. To kind of just wrap it up in a second, though, it's just bad things are going to happen, and it doesn't matter how much we try to mitigate those bad things from happening, they will still happen. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to lessen the severity, but I think we have to understand as a society that it doesn't matter how much you legislate or how much you try to build a wall to protect inside of a bubble, still things will happen and things will permeate that bubble. So I do see a shift in us trying to overcompensate and over outcome, pre-plan the outcome. I don't find that to be very exciting, to be honest.
Yeah, and you mentioned community. You mentioned I've been reading up on these blue zones around the world. There are these areas where, like, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Ikara in Greece. There's a place in Sicily, I think. These places where cancer is almost non-existent. People living longer. One of the things that they have is there's a strong sense of community. Every night they go out to the town square. They do that. We don't really have that here, and there's certain aspects of social media. For instance, on LinkedIn, where there is a community without a lot of the BS that you'd find on Facebook.
Yeah.
I find that a lot of people, unfortunately, and I don't blame social media, I blame us, right? People that they'll sit on the couch for 8 hours a day, staring at social media, staring at their phone, watching cable TV, whether it's Fox News and MSNBC. And I always like to say, listen, they're the same exact thing, just different entertainers.
Different audiences.
But because they have their head down the entire time, not only is there a lack of community, but things that when there's a shooting in California, you know about it a second later in South Carolina.
Right.
And you immediately worry that there's a threat around every corner. Whereas the same things, the statistics, right? Things were more dangerous actually in the 70s and 80s, but you didn't know about it. Right? And I feel, you and I both worked in social media, and there were aspects of it that sometimes I would do stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm taking advantage of this. Trying to
bridging a situation.
Yeah.
No, there's a couple of things you said there. And one, social media is a tool, and you are correct to point out that it's not social media's fault any more than it's the car's fault or the firearm, from my perspective.
Sure.
They're all
right.
tools. It takes a person to wield it. And it's not social media's fault. I like to say, so, we've both worked in social media, online, digital, all that. I often say that, people that work on social media have no social life. And it is so true so often because we associate those outlets and platforms with increased engagement and outreach. And more often than not, we're more concerned with the screen than we are with what's happening 10 feet around us. Right. And the velocity in which that we're receiving, aggregating, and consuming news now creates the atmosphere of, wow, all of this is happening at this moment. It's just gonna explode,
Yeah.
And I was going to say earlier, when I was growing up, there was just as many dangers, but we weren't paralyzed by the fear because we weren't being, fed this tube of constant stream. It's just, people will say, increases the awareness of what's going on. And hey, I'm all for it. More knowledge, better. I think it's great, but you also have to filter it with reality. Right. And just because that we have more car stats about getting into automobile accidents, I don't really see anybody going out and driving their car less now because of it. Right. So I think we've picked and choose what we're tolerant to in terms of all this data.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I feel like it started, around, we didn't have social media, but it, around the dawn of 24/7 news,
yeah.
The OJ, I remember sitting there and watching the chase. And now it's like every kidnapping, people are by the TV, and it's like, I'm not saying I don't feel for the kidnapped victim,
sure,
but what am I going to do about it? There's nothing I can do to control it except sit there. And then you end up getting addicted to it and not going out and doing anything. It's like, okay, you're mad on one side or the other about immigration.
Sure.
Have you done something
right
on either side to make a difference? Have you walked doors for a candidate? Like, get out, get some exercise and walk doors for a candidate. Go volunteer. If you're really concerned about it, go volunteer to shelter.
Maybe
do something.
Maybe the political parties should sponsor Fitbit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Walk them doors.
But it is a sense of when you become a slave to it and you don't get out and try to do something to control the destiny of what you want to happen, right? If it's an issue, your community, whatever, right, then that goes back to your definition of freedom.
Yeah.
You've lost a sense of it because you feel helpless because the news is happening to you rather than getting up and being like, this sucks. I'm going to go make a change, and turning off the phone.
Agreed. Yeah, no, there's so many places to go with that. I used to think that, man, if I can get out on a digital platform and reach 1 million people, with a tweet or a Facebook post or an email campaign, which are all fine. They're fine. But if you allow that to become your activism, it takes more than somebody on a screen. You know,
Right.
The human interaction will never be replaced by a screen. And the impact, the true impact, is far greater when you're able to, instead of putting a hashtag on a message, actually say it to a person.
Right.
And live that in a person. You know, and ooh, you know, taboo for the digital guy to be saying this.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
No, it's true though. It's absolutely true. Yeah. Especially in people's just daily lives.
yes. No, I find the online activism warriors have a lot of hashtags and have a lot of memes and gifs, but if we were to take a third of that energy and apply it to tangible boots on the ground, I guess you could say, I would think that things would be a little different. Whatever side of the aisle you fall on any issue.
Right.
I love seeing engaged citizenry, but being in politics, you know, unfortunately, fortunately for some, I guess, consultants or, you know, whatever, if you're in that realm, you know, you're playing to 10%.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me, if I could just go here for a second.
Yeah.
Amazing to me, the founding fathers, again, you know, whatever your view of history, whatever, but this is true, that the premise was building this country on a active citizenry. And the presupposition was that the people would still be involved actively and not passively. And freedom is something, it's a daily exercise. Okay. Freedom is a daily exercise that must be worked out, you know, and it doesn't happen. Change doesn't happen from passive, hearing. Comes from active doing and listening. You know, I think we've become complacent, I guess is where I'm going with this. I think we've become complacent as a society and as individuals. Maybe because we feel disenfranchised or we feel like we're too small and we can't have a true impact because we've looked towards these big enterprises as well. X, Y, and Z corporation or ABC, you know, government institution has this handled. I'm just one person. I think that we've removed our individual responsibility and our individual worth, value, and respect for ourselves, to be quite honest, that we feel like we don't truly have an individual impact anymore. But it flies in the face of logic because a collection is made up of individuals. So
yeah, and I think whether it's the right or the left, and you know, you see some people on the right with Trump, and you see some people on the left with Trump on this. But when you become so obsessed with, and listen, I used to be like this, right? When you become so obsessed with the politicians, for good or for bad, they're going to make the difference. They're going to do this. They're going to, you know, you're giving away a lot of your empowerment and personal freedom because there's going to be crappy presidents. There's going to be good presidents. There's going to be bad legislatures, good legislatures. Are you just going to fold up and go home? People build businesses I talk to people all the time on LinkedIn and reach out for me who are in Nigeria building a business. I was just in Egypt, you know, when it's 18 pounds to the dollar, when it was like 9 pounds to the dollar a year ago, and there's nothing, and they're still making their way. It's like, okay, you're so concerned about this, whatever. But they're giving away, they're outsourcing their personal freedom to these benevolent angels that don't exist, whether it's a benevolent angel on the right or the left.
Doesn't matter.
You know, and even the ones who are remotely angelic facing, you know, they have their wings clipped as soon as they take the oath of office anyway. So, you know, I'm not, you know, I know I sound negative on politics, but really what I'm trying to be is more positive about humans, that just go and do your shit, make it happen. Yeah, I'd vote. I didn't vote this year because I didn't have anyone I wanted to vote for. And like when the person I would have voted for just says some stupid stuff, I'm like, you know what? You're going to lose. This dude's going to be elected and he's horrible and he's going to be unelected in 2 years. So I'll wait 2 years. It's like, I don't know. I just,
you're practicing delayed gratification.
Yeah. Welcome. Yeah. I'm willing to wait it out, take the long view. But so you and I, well, like I said, I worked in that realm for a long time.
Yep.
You're in it right now.
Yep.
But you've had an interesting journey that I want to talk about. And there was a recent documentary about you and the journey that you took.
Right.
And, you worked in politics for a number of years and you ended up where a lot of political consultants want to be, right? On a presidential campaign. You were running all the digital fun for Ben Carson, who at one point was leading the pack, right? For months, for a long time.
Yep.
Raised a ton of money thanks to you. So why don't you tell us about that? What's that like? Kind of reaching
the zenith.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're working on a presidential campaign, and for people who don't understand, all right, Carson didn't win.
No.
But a presidential campaign is a presidential campaign.
Right.
And, he was in the lead for a long time. And there was a ton of money being raised. So tell us about that.
Sure. It's still interesting for me talking about it nowadays, because even for the people that were in my family or in my close circle of friends, they're still learning about really what it was that I did. Because here's this country kid, that grew up in Athens, Pennsylvania, little valley on a farm, makes his way into the military, and then through all that gets involved in politics. Long story short, ends up the digital director of a presidential campaign. Yeah, so it's still interesting and, kind of weird for me talking about it to this day. But yes, it was a calling, to be honest. I've always found that I have a way of connecting with people, right or left. And in politics, that is a good skill set to have. Being able to take, somewhat lofty and intangible ideas and principles and relay them to people in a way that's digestible and consumable. So that's really why I felt called. I felt called from my gifts and abilities to go to that campaign. And to say the least, I have a couple stories, couple calls at 3 a.m. But I'll save that for my book.
Yeah, and it's, I've never worked on a presidential. I've worked on some tier 1 Senate campaigns and congressional campaigns, and it takes a lot. I remember my wife and I got married, and so 2 months before we got married, I was on a Senate campaign. He lost.
Yeah.
I got a call 2 days later and said, all right, you're going to go out to Iowa to live and work on this campaign. Yeah. Another campaign. So my wife and I, my fiance at the time, who's now my wife, said, okay, we're moving to Des Moines. So we had planned, I think we were looking at places. We didn't make any offers or anything. And they said, no, sorry. We want you to go out to DC instead. Sent me out to DC. So, all right. So the week after our wedding, I moved before our wedding. She moved a week after. We go out there, and then a month and a half into the campaign, something had happened with the current communications director, and they said, now you got to come out to Des Moines. So I went out to Des Moines for a number of months and told my wife, hey, we're married. Wonderful. Great. You moved to DC for me. Sorry, I got to go. And left her. And, that was rough. So it takes a toll. Even small campaigns take a toll.
Oh yeah.
Presidential has to take a exponential toll.
Yeah. So at the time of me being on that campaign, I actually was married. Uh, my then wife was coming out of being in PA school, to be a physician assistant.
Mm-hmm.
So very rigorous. It's kind of in your vein. I moved down to Virginia. She stayed up in Pennsylvania doing her what you would call residency for the PA program, and then she eventually moved down to Virginia with me. And shortly after is when I got recruited to the Carson campaign, and that involved, we were living in Leesburg, Virginia at the time, and the campaign headquarters was down in Alexandria, and so I was driving like, oh my gosh, like 2 hours every one way
Yeah.
every day. It was really rough. So we eventually moved to Reston, and that made it a little easier. But yeah,
But that's still a hike, by the way.
oh, it's still a hike. I mean,
Yeah.
didn't matter whether I took, the Silver Line, the Metro. That was
Mm-hmm.
still a good distance. Or if I drove, I was on the road all day. But yeah, it was rough because it was rough on many levels because I felt conflicted many times. And I actually said to her many times, I feel like if this is getting in the way of our marriage, I will leave the campaign. And I remember she said every single time, she's like, no, God has called you to this position, and look at all the people that you're impacting. I've said it before. I served as the online voice of Dr. Carson. From the fireside chats on Facebook, me responding to people as Dr. Carson, writing all that up and responding, and the marketing and the videos and just the whole thing, right? And all the thanks Hillary videos or whatever, all the little funny things that people have seen. This is the freedom conversation. I did feel a bit trapped in my own success because the world has one standard of the 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 more you're doing and the better you're doing, the metric for that looks this way, right? That's the way the graph looks.
Yeah.
But there's always a price to pay for that. And as I said in the documentary, you could have in the world, those aren't bad things. Like we're, going back, tools are tools. They aren't inherently bad, good. They're neutral. It's use the person how you wield it. But yeah, it took a toll on me personally and in the marriage. And she left actually at the height of the campaign.
Wow.
And yeah, it was very hard because here I am, my professional trajectory is like this, and my personal trajectory is like that.
Yeah.
And at the height of the campaign, we're front runner, and my wife is gone. Yeah, to say the least, I had some very somber nights alone. I was working 7 days a week. I definitely let the campaign fill that void. You know what I mean? I was like, well, I loved my wife and I fought for my wife for 2 years. And I fought for that marriage, but I definitely have to admit that I let my professional life overcompensate for the void that was there. And I was trapped in that freedom, I was trapped in my own success.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted even after the campaign, everybody wanted what I did on the Carson campaign, and I delivered in different ways, with the different clients that I worked with and organizations I worked with. I definitely delivered. But again, that comes at a price, and it's taken a while for me to live out my own definition of freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's, in DC, I mean, I see a ton of these types of stories, things like this that have happened either relationship wise or health wise, alcoholism, massive smoking, heart attacks, you name it. And you see there's a lot of older political consultants at parties that more than you see other places, like out in the real world, drinking the O'Douls or the non-alcoholic. Like a lot of, you go out and it's like, okay, yep, he's been through the battle, and he used to be married, and so so it's in the middle of a campaign, right, which is 7 days a week, sometimes 17 hours a day, whatever, or more.
Yep, or more.
Your wife leaves. How many more months did you have on the campaign, and how did you try to put out that fire while, you know what I mean?
Yeah. What was it? It was another 6 months on the campaign like that. Between always being true to my principle, right? So Dr. Carson, I had to maintain the game face. I had to perform. And I had the added responsibility of making sure that everything was seamless on that campaign. I do thank God that I had a great team that I had assembled bit by bit. And that was a absolute blessing. But at the same time, trying to fight for my marriage, that was, again, a lot of introspection, reflection, somber times, thinking about what truly matters. Character is not necessarily built, but it is definitely revealed. And going back to really thinking about what truly matters, what is it in this life that God wants me to do? Why has he gifted me the way he has in certain areas? It's like, if this is the end all be all, this is a very shallow winner's circle.
Yeah.
And again, I want to kind of, reiterate what you were saying. I am not jaded by politics in any way.
Yeah.
Not at all. I would do another presidential if I was aligned with the candidate. I'm still involved in politics. I wasn't maligned, and I'm not jaded. So I don't want that to be what people are hearing right now.
Right.
However, just because what I had to learn is just because you're winning on the surface does not mean that you're truly leveraging your talents and purpose correctly.
Yeah.
Your purpose is greater than what you do.
Yeah. And
when you start realizing that and applying yourself in a purpose driven way that takes traditional metrics and standards of success and starts applying it to more the human connection, for me as a Christian, I had to really come around to that. I allowed myself to get inside the DC bubble, and it's a wild ride, but it'll consume you. It consumes everybody.
Yeah. No, it is a pressure cooker. Well, let me ask you, what, in hindsight's 2020, right?
Sure. I wear contacts.
What would you have done differently
Yeah.
in the midst of the campaign? So you take the campaign, there's obvious problems, issues going on.
Yes.
What would you have done differently there and then, knowing now what you know? Would you have left the campaign, or would you have changed some things to create more alignment?
You know what? If you would have asked me that a little while ago, I think I would have said I would have left the campaign. But I don't think I would have left the campaign. Looking back on it now, I would have changed my I would have changed the pressure on myself, because nothing can happen to you unless, I can't say nothing, but what happens in your life you allow to happen more often than not. And it is always your responsibility how you react to it. It doesn't matter what is thrown your way, but it is your responsibility how you react. And the DC pressure cooker and all that, and politics and stuff, honestly, that's going to be around you no matter what. But what you can do is control what you allow to permeate into your life. And what I would have changed is not allowing myself to feel the pressure of the world, the weight of the world, like understanding the perspective of what my mission was. And I took the weight of everything on my shoulders rather than, again, rather than God, to be quite honest, just to be quite blunt. I thought it was like my responsibility to make sure that everything was perfect, and that Dr. Carson would get elected. I played my own little God, to be honest. And
took it home with you.
I did 100% took it home with me. Like, as I said in the documentary, I loved my wife, but that campaign was my life.
Yeah.
And even when I was home, I wasn't mentally there, and that's not freedom.
Yeah.
That's not freedom. It's really not. And there's nothing wrong with being, passionate about what you do, right? But again, I think you can get trapped in your own success and your own gifts if you allow it.
No, totally. And it's not just politics. I had a guy last week, and he may become a client, but fear is kind of holding him back from jumping in at this point. But I asked him, he's very successful. He's worked for some major corporations, and he's been near the top at some major corporations in Europe and North America. And I asked him, I said, how's your marriage? And his answer was, it's good. And I said, oh man. I said, how's your relationship with your two kids? He said, it's pretty good, but the temperature of the house varies depending on the stress I take home from work.
Yeah, totally.
And often I will ask people, I've written a couple things on this, how much do you want for your wife? They're like, what? I'm like, how much money? Well, that's a stupid question. I said, okay, so what's holding you back from making a change in your life? And they'll say, well, I'm unhappy, but I got to keep my $250,000 salary.
Yep.
And I said, so 250, that's the price. That's how much you want for your wife, because she's going to leave. And you can convince yourself you're doing this for her and you're doing this for the kids. But it's BS, because relationships, Harvard's followed hundreds of men for 75 years, undergrads through now.
Yep. They
found out that none of it mattered. It was relationships that mattered. And it's hard for people to grasp that and admit it.
100%. Could not have said that better. That was a huge portion of what was happening on that campaign. I was driven in a good way to provide, right? That's built into me. Like growing up on a farm, I wrestled my entire life. Military. Okay, so I have this like hard charger attitude and drive. It's like provide, do that. And I wanted to provide for my wife so much that I was like, I gotta push through this And on the other end of this campaign, there's going to be X, Y, and Z, and the lights at the end of the tunnel. I mean, I remember talking to her dad about this, and he was like, Matt, you can do it. You keep pushing. You're setting yourself up. You're setting you and your wife up, for, later. And I was like, okay. And I felt like, okay, the more I do and the harder I put, the more I'm going to elevate us to more financial gain after the campaign. And we're going to be great and all this stuff and this nice condo that we bought and all this, I just, that story is that resonates with me so much. It's because, you have, I think we've placed so much pressure on us as a society that it's the stuff that reflects how good you're doing, right? It's the money in the bank account. And again, from the doctor, money is not evil. Having a lot of money is not a bad thing. Not at all. It's just when you start chasing that rather than your purpose, then that's when you run into a problem. And when you start letting not only just the relationships in your family, but the relationship with yourself. Like, I can take the abuse. I can work this. I will beat myself into the ground. And that's what I was letting myself do. I was beating myself into the ground, for that at the end of the tunnel type thing, and that story, you just, that person, that resonates with me so much.
It happens all the time. I mean, I was there too. And then finally I'm like, I'm going to lose them. So what? It's not worth it anymore.
That's great. You're absolutely right. That, how much do you want for your wife? Well, that's how much you're making. So that must be.
Yeah. Because you're miserable now. You're going to lose her. Your relationship isn't good. Your relationship with your kids isn't good. You're not happy. You've called me because you want a coach to help you with these things. But you're saying the one thing holding you back is the one thing that's probably crushing you. But my point is, like you said, listen, I love money, but I love it for different reasons than I used to. I used to love it for money's sake and for buying stuff. Now it's to purchase a tool to purchase fulfillment. But you can make a lot of money. You can provide for your family and still be happy and still have fulfillment. And, too often we get in that box of, well, I've been in sales for 22 years, so all I can do is sales. Or I've done this, and and so that's so tell me about the documentary, how that came about, and because it's a very personal story, and for you to say, listen, I'm going to go do it. You said I've seen the 6-minute or 7-minute version. You said there's a 30-minute version. So how did that come about, and how did you agree to, okay, I'm going to go bare all in this documentary?
Sure.
And to be clear, there's no nudity. When I say bare all, it's your soul.
Bare my soul. Well, we are Italian. I mean, all you would see is chest hair.
Exactly. Right. It looks like you're wearing a sweater anyway. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's winter months. So to answer that question, faith has always been very important to me. I came to have a serious relationship with Christ when I was around 21, 22. And so this whole time, throughout the campaign, again, my wife and everybody in my life, me, thinking, and it was a God calling, 100%. It was a God calling. So at the end of the campaign, I'm working with a well-known entity, I had moved on from the campaign and still having success professionally. I remember I went out onto my condo deck at the time because I had 2 cats at the time, because my wife, she loved cats, and we got cats, and I'm a dog guy, and I was converted to love all animals now. That's the real miracle, Curt. That is the
right. Yeah. You cannot convert me to be a cat guy. I'm just sorry.
No, I love it when people that own cats are like, oh yeah, he's just like a dog. It's like, well, then go get a dog.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so I'm out on the deck, and I remember I'm just thinking, right? And I hear God speak to me internally and say, Matt, I've given you money, power, influence, and position. Everything that you thought that you wanted and needed. Are you happy? And I said no. And I bawled like a baby.
Yeah.
And I said, anything that's in my life that's getting in the way of where you want me to be and what you want me to be doing, remove it. Anything and anyone. And that is what started in 2016. And he has been doing that since then. So long story short, or fast forward, I should say,
Yeah.
I moved back to Pennsylvania, where I'm originally from, and I get connected with friends that are part of this church, and people in the church start realizing what I've done. That gets up to the lead pastor. We sit, we talk. He wants to get to know me, and a great conversation. And I was asked if I would be willing to share my story. And I had to really pray on that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of details, in my story that, I've never really talked about publicly. And like I was telling you before, there's people inside my own family that after they watched the documentary, they're like, wait, you mean you did that? Like, no, because I don't really talk about it. I'm telling you, ever since then, there's a very select few people that really know what I did.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was interesting to go through that process of reliving everything. The whole point and impact of that was supposed to be, the world's standards for success is not necessarily Christ's. And for even for people that aren't don't believe, aren't Christian, or
Sure.
they're not faith based, I still think that it's applicable. That whether it's your own innate human philanthropy, unless you're living out your true purpose, it doesn't matter how much stuff you have.
Yeah.
Stuff will fade, and relationships will not.
Yeah.
And yeah, I could go on forever talking about the emotional roller coaster it was to go through the filming of that. It was rough, but I was like, if this reaches one person and affects them in a positive way, then I am more than happy to share my story this way.
Where can people view it? It's online now. People can go and view it. Where's the best place to view it?
Probably they can go to Vimeo. They can look it up. If they go to Grace Valley Fellowships, GVF, they go
Okay.
they can find it.
And we'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the easiest way to find it. It's Matt's story. It's it was really well done. It came out really well. There's a lot more there, obviously, but yeah, it was emotional, and it's still emotional to this day. Thinking about it, I still have people calling me, messaging me, finding me, telling me how it impacted them. And that is what it was meant to do. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and spreading that impact to the people listening. We have people around the world listening to the podcast. And as I mentioned, I'm going to put a link to the documentary and all your other fun contact points in the show notes. So if you want to get a hold of, if you're listening and you're like, I got to hire Matt, Matt needs to be my digital voice. The links will be in the show notes, but also to the documentary, which, I saw the 6 or 7 minute version. It was very powerful.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.